Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Vasquez Jr., and I'm a graduate student at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, studying international environmental policy with a concentration in sustainability management. Before we start today's presentation on improving the transparency of the fashion industry's supply chain, I would like to introduce and thank the President and Executive Director of Women Forward International, Dr. Kent Davis-Packard, who has sponsored and supported this project in association with Fashion Revolution. Women Forward International's goal for this project is to illuminate the environmental issues within the fashion industry supply chain and to provide some concrete recommendations on how to hold the fashion industry accountable for the adverse environmental outcomes of the production and manufacturing of garments and what impacted stakeholders can do to leverage this effort. I would like to formally thank Women Forward International for this opportunity to research such an important topic. As I've discovered through my research, the fashion industry and its extensive supply chain network is extremely complex and has cascading effects on people all over the globe, including the millions of garment workers worldwide, of which an overwhelming majority are women. I would argue that most consumers are unaware of the fashion industry's environmental and social impacts, but I hope this research increases scrutiny from civil society, serving as a catalyst for change from governments and policymakers. I would also like to mention that thanks to this research opportunity from Women Forward International, I have started to search for roles in the fashion industry so that I may be a part of the much needed transition to a clean, safe, fair, transparent, and accountable fashion industry. Now join me in welcoming Dr. Kent Davis-Packard.
Thank you so much, Richie. Well, there is a revolution happening, and it's not a formal, institutionalized one. It's the one that is taking place in the individual human consciousness that makes us reevaluate the impact of each of our actions on others, because the revolution that we're experiencing causes us to recognize that we all are one part of one human family. And Women Forward International is so pleased to hear the results of this excellent partnership between Middlebury College and Fashion Revolution, our partners, that the topic of the research is timely, significant, and it demonstrates the cross-section between care for the environment and human equality. So thank you again to our partners at Middlebury College and at Fashion Revolution, and we look forward to hearing this beneficial presentation.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I will share my screen. Bear with me. Okay, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Kent. Now, let's talk about the topic at hand, greater transparency on energy use in the fashion industry. This project is a collaborative effort of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, International Environmental Policy Program, in collaboration with Fashion Revolution, the world's largest fashion activism movement, mobilizing citizens, industry, and policymakers through research, education, and advocacy work, and sponsored by Women Forward International. In order to process and manufacture clothing, thermal heat, like this image of a coal boiler, is required for wet processes like dyeing and generating steam. The use of coal, the dirtiest of all fossil fuels, is quite common in the fashion industry or in the fashion supply chain, but most brands aren't disclosing their supplier energy needs or sources, leaving investors, consumers, and regulators without meaningful insight into the greatest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the supply chain. This is compounded by the fact that the top clothing exporting countries are also some of the biggest consumers of fossil fuels, including coal. So let's talk about the project briefly. As previously stated, this project was a collaborative effort between Women Forward International and Fashion Revolution. The main priority of the project was to research energy use in the fashion industry supply chain, which is notoriously obscure due to its complexity, and thus disclosure on energy use is lacking transparency. The fashion industry supply chain is a complex system of factories and manufacturers primarily located in Asia that are often operating with little oversight. Polluted waterways, greenhouse gas emissions, forced labor, and extreme poverty pay, unsafe work environments, and violence against women are hidden behind the clothes we wear every day. The fashion industry's supply chain emissions are so ambiguous that experts have estimated that the industry is responsible for 2 to 8% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. According to the World Resources Institute and the Apparel Impact Institute, the fashion industry emits about 2% of total global emissions. However, a 2018 report from Qantas estimated the industry accounts for 8.1% of total global emissions. The true impact of the fashion industry will not be known until brands are required to track and report supply chain energy use that covers scopes 1, 2, and 3. The latest report from the IPCC says that all emissions need to be halved and coal use must be decreased by 75% by 2030 in order to stay within a 1.5 degree scenario, 1.5 degrees Celsius climate change scenario and avoid catastrophic climate change. Under a business as usual scenario, global temperatures are predicted to surpass the 1.5 degree Celsius threshold of global temperature rise, creating an unstable climate. This will lead to increasingly powerful storms, floods, drought, wildfires, heat waves, and other extreme weather events we are already experiencing across the globe, wreaking havoc on already vulnerable populations. Global greenhouse gas emissions are increasing the frequency of extreme temperatures that will challenge the poor working conditions of the 40 to 60 million garment workers worldwide, of which 80% are women. Studies show that the average temperature has already risen 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This year in India, one of the largest clothing exporting countries, has experienced record temperatures and a heat wave that is affecting about 323 million people who are at high risk of extreme heat. In mid-May of this year, temperatures in New Delhi soared above 49 degrees Celsius or 120 degrees Fahrenheit, increasing the risk of death from overheating and impacting food security and incomes. Greenhouse gas emissions must be rapidly reduced to prevent the worst effects of climate change and protect global populations. Disclosure and measuring of the fashion industry's emissions are critical to decreasing total global emissions. Fashion Revolution will use this research as a basis for a larger ongoing project to improve indicators related to energy and carbon emissions within the Fashion Transparency Index. The research and resulting blog can also be used to inform policymakers and civil society about greater legislative options and calls to action. Total company emissions can be separated into 3 categories: scope 1, 2, and 3. Supply chain emissions fall under the scope 3 category, but targets or disclosures for scope 3 emissions are markedly absent from most fashion company climate pledges. In a study of 30 brands that had science-based targets, the World Resource Institute and Apparel Impact Institute estimate that of the fashion companies assessed, scope 3 emissions account for about 96% of total greenhouse gas emissions, of which 80% are due to the extraction, production, and transportation of goods and services purchased or acquired by the reporting company. The energy sources for production and manufacturing are highly dependent on national energy grids, which can be heavy consumers of fossil fuels. When brands do not disclose the location of the facilities where our clothes are being produced, it is difficult to improve potential human rights and environmental abuses occurring there, as there's no way to hold the brand accountable. With respect to greenhouse gas emissions, Data from the 2021 Fashion Transparency Index, or FTI, showed that the 250 brands assessed, 62% disclosed their carbon footprint at the owned or operated facilities level. This is where the head office and retail stores are located. Moving further down the supply chain, just 26% of brands publish their carbon footprint at the manufacturing or processing level. This is where the fabric is processed and transformed into garments. Finally, just 17% of the 250 brands included in the index disclose their carbon footprint at the raw material level. There is a clear lack of visibility the further down the supply chain you go. Transparency is important as it enables scrutiny of brands' practices, which ultimately holds them accountable for malpractice, and this leads to change. Fashion industry supply chain facilities are primarily located in Asian countries that rely heavily on cheap and abundant coal resources for their national energy grids. Production and manufacturing, as I stated previously, require thermal energy for dyeing and wet processes. Thermal energy sources include coal and biomass burning, for example, burning wood pellets. Burning coal is synonymous with climate change, but burning wood has been largely considered net zero because trees are able to sequester carbon. Unfortunately, the rate trees sequester carbon is extremely slow and would take hundreds of years of management to ensure they store the same carbon that would be emitted from burning them. In short, wood should not be used for biomass. Increasingly, this is the industry standard and will require innovative solutions to replace coal and wood burning in manufacturing facilities. Current fabric dyeing requires thermal heat and water to generate steam, but fashion brands should invest in waterless dyeing techniques or concentrated solar techniques that can replace the outdated and inefficient current practices. Using updated machinery and high efficiency processes will also decrease energy use and lower emissions. Most new clothing is made from polyester, a cheap crude oil-based synthetic material. It is estimated that in 2015, polyester production alone was responsible for over 700 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, about the same annual greenhouse gas emissions of 180 coal-fired power plants. Synthetic fibers made from crude oil and methane gas, such as polyester, polypropylene, nylon, acrylic, elastane, and others now account for more than 69% of all textile fibers and are projected to reach 73% of all materials used in textiles by 2030. The production of polyester is an energy-intensive process that requires more than 2 times as much energy as cotton. Polyester production also requires the extraction and processing of crude oil, adding to the environmental impact of the material now dominant in the clothing we wear every day. Synthetic fibers like polyester are also a major source of microfiber or microplastic pollution, which is plaguing the planet. These minuscule plastic fibers that shed while washing, drying, and wearing our clothes are making their way to every ecosystem on the planet and are increasingly found in human bodies. Although this microplastic and microfiber pollution is now commonly found in our bodies and in the environment, little is known of the long-term effects. And data from the 2021 FTI reveals that only 21% of the world's largest fashion brands disclose what they are doing to minimize the impacts of microfibers. The fashion industry needs to phase out fossil fuel-based fibers and replace them with environmentally preferred materials such as organic cotton. Reports show the consumption of clothing and footwear is expected to increase by 63% by 2030, with no industry-wide solution for the disposal, collection, or recycling of discarded textiles. An estimated 5.8 million tons of textiles are discarded each year in the EU, the equivalent of 11 kilograms or 24 pounds per person. Fiber-to-fiber recycling in the EU accounts for just 0.1% of discarded textiles, while the rest are dumped in landfills or incinerated. Infrastructure and policy are needed to ensure that synthetic fibers are captured before they reach landfills or incineration, so they can be recycled or disposed of properly. When synthetic fibers are disposed of in landfills, they will take hundreds of years to degrade or impede the degradation of other organic materials. Incinerating synthetic fibers is known to release hazardous chemicals and increase greenhouse gas emissions. The world's largest clothing exporting countries include China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Turkey, and Indonesia. Most of these countries have national energy grids that rely heavily on fossil fuels. A 2021 report by Carbon Tracker identified China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Japan as being responsible for over 80% of the world's planned new coal plants and 75% of existing coal capacity. Industry experts claim that coal accounts for an astonishing 75% of energy use in the fashion supply chain. The Southeast and South Asia region represents 65% of globally proposed new coal plants outside China. This chart on the right simply shows the top clothing exporting countries in the world, with China dominating the industry. The chart on the left shows a mix of the top countries sourcing their energy from coal and the top clothing exporting countries. It's a mix of the two. And as you can see, China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, and Bangladesh have national grids that source a majority of their energy from fossil fuels like coal, and oil, and gas. Knowledge of coal use and the associated pollution and greenhouse gas emissions should urge action from large companies looking to lower their emissions. Yet, a recent study by CDP found that fewer than 38% of reported brands encourage their suppliers to act on climate change, and only 18% of the 250 brands included in the 2021 FTI published data on absolute energy reduction in the supply chain. The most efficient way to reduce emissions is the use of renewable energy in manufacturing and processing facilities. However, the 2021 FTI data also showed that 44% of the 250 brands reviewed disclosed the percentage of energy from renewable sources in the company's owned and operated facilities, while barely 7% disclosed the percentage of energy from renewable sources in the supply chain, where energy reform is most needed. Renewable energy use in the supply chain is necessary to reduce total emissions, but many companies are reluctant to invest in renewables as supplier facilities because of the upfront cost and the short contract terms. Another issue is that renewable energy generation is limited by the size of the facility. For instance, limited space can restrict how many solar panels can be installed. Many brands are resorting to purchasing renewable energy from sources outside their supplier facilities to lower their emissions. Energy attribute certificates, or EACs, including renewable energy certificates, or RECs, and others, seem like a responsible way to purchase renewable energy, but can be very limited in their ability to abate emissions. EACs allow companies to purchase contracts of 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy to offset their emissions. However, these certificates are for energy that is most certainly located outside the supplier's energy grid and will have no effect on the supplier's emissions or decrease global greenhouse gas emissions. Power purchase agreements, or PPAs, are another way that brands are able to purchase renewable energy for their supply chain operations. These contracts for renewable energy are long-term contracts with private utilities for renewable energy that suits the company's needs. However, not every country has a PPA market, making it difficult for companies looking to lower their greenhouse gas emissions. There are different types of PPAs, but the most effective is a direct power purchase agreement. This allows companies to purchase power that is directly linked to their supplier's energy grid. Recently, a coalition of 30 large international and domestic businesses, including Nike, Puma, Adidas, and H&M, sent a letter to the Ministry of Industry and Trade of Vietnam asking for support in developing a pilot direct power purchase agreement, or DPPA program, because Vietnam didn't have a PPA market. The Ministry of Industry and Trade has since released a draft of the DPPA mechanism they will pursue later this year in order to assist the companies with procuring renewable energy. National grids are another way to provide renewable energy to supplier facilities, but as I've mentioned, most of the national grids where clothing is being manufactured and processed are dependent on fossil fuels. Legislation is instrumental in creating a safer environment for employees and limiting harmful pollutants. The EU taxonomy regulation is one example of standardizing the language used by companies when referencing sustainability and green investments. The EU's eco-design for sustainable products will ban greenwashing practices that mislead customers about the durability or environmental footprint of its products. It will also encourage a more circular economy that emphasizes recyclability, repairability, and quality products that last longer. The EU's strategy for sustainable and circular textiles also emphasizes the need for quality materials that are recyclable and calls for a circular economy for all textiles. The UK has recently mandated climate disclosures for companies that have more than 500 employees and more than 500 million in turnover. They emphasize using the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures reporting framework, as a guide, but do not require disclosure of Scope 3 emissions or enforce progress on stated goals. The US SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commission, has also announced the implementation of mandatory climate disclosures for all publicly listed companies. However, the mandate leaves the inclusion of Scope 3 emissions up to the company. According to the SEC, if a company has found Scope 3 emissions to be material, or if they have set greenhouse gas emissions targets or goals that include Scope 3 emissions, then they need to disclose Scope 3 emissions. So they would need to disclose it if they have only talked about it in their climate disclosure already. These mandates will allow companies to ignore some of the greatest sources of emissions in their value chain and enable them to continue to emit harmful pollutants. The following are recommendations from this research. Brands should disclose and track the energy consumption of supplier facilities by energy source, because measurable and accountable emissions reductions plans start with transparent disclosure. Most importantly, transparency enables scrutiny and accountability by civil society policymakers and others. Brands should verify their net zero goals with the Science Based Targets Initiative, or the SBTI, to ensure that emissions reduction pathways are clearly defined and in line with the latest climate science. It is essential that brands' claims can be evidenced by verified sources and stand up to public scrutiny. Brands should aim to phase out new synthetic fibers like virgin polyester by establishing time-bound measurable targets and publicly track their progress against this, while increasing the uptake of environmentally preferred materials such as organic cotton. As they have the most influence, resources, and power, major brands and retailers must work with their suppliers to support their transition to renewable energy sources as quickly as possible. Brands have a responsibility to encourage the governments in countries from where they are sourcing their clothes to boost their renewable energy infrastructure with direct power purchase agreements, or DPPAs, as they have the influence to do so. Governments need to ensure that mandatory disclosure of Scope 3 emissions are included in new legislation in order to be robust, impactful, and effective in reducing fashion's carbon footprint. In tandem with this, Following the lead of the EU eco-design for sustainable products, other countries, governments should follow suit and enact laws and regulations that ban greenwashing to help facilitate the transition to a circular economy that respects people and the planet. A 2021 report by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, found that renewable power generation is now cheaper than fossil fuels, showing that price is no longer a justification for inaction. Now is the time for governments to decarbonize their economies and make the transition to renewable energy. Civil society, including consumers, NGOs, and labor rights organizations, should require that brands increase transparency, reduce fossil fuel use, and demand disclosure of verified science-based targets. The public should encourage stricter requirements from coalitions and discourage biofuels, such as wood burning, as an alternative to burning coal. The public should support organizations like Fashion Revolution that are aimed at creating a more transparent fashion industry and use the findings of the Fashion Transparency Index to enable their activism and to continue to ask brands critical questions, scrutinizing their environmental disclosures. We are in a climate crisis. We don't have time to be proving chains of responsibility. As the largest power brokers in the industry, brands and retailers need to be doing more to reduce their carbon footprint and disclose meaningful and actionable data. Thank you for listening to the presentation today. I will stop sharing, but please let me know if you have any questions.
Edie, question.
Yeah, so your slide when it was talking about these different countries and relationship to scope 3, the emissions reporting, it's like, are there any examples of countries that, it doesn't have to be European, anywhere, that are actually on scope 3, or is this something that is just that right now we're just working to get countries to even be aware of this? I mean, where are we at with the scope 3 piece?
Yeah, so the scope 3 emissions that I was primarily talking about, these are mostly from the brands themselves disclosing their scope 3 emissions. I didn't really look into the scope 3 emissions at the country level, but as far as brands, fashion brands are concerned.
Well, you had that slide that had it in different countries related to the scope 3. So maybe I just need an explanation of that slide. I didn't understand the slide.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That I could also possibly go back.
Yeah, it was confusing to me. I was curious about that. Are there any examples of countries? It sounds like the mandatory piece is like, countries are working on this. Is there any countries that have attained this kind of reporting?
Yeah, so that was a snapshot, I could go back, of the top clothing exporting countries.
So when energy consumption.
Yeah, so this is the energy consumption of the countries. And if you just look at the energy consumption of China, India, Vietnam, these are all of the top textile exporting countries, and their energy mix is primarily fossil fuels.
Right.
So it's hard for, my point was, a lot of these fashion brands are making claims about being net carbon neutral or net zero. But a lot of those claims are hard to back up when, as you can tell, the countries where they are sourcing their products are not using renewable energy to any degree.
Yeah, I understood this slide. It was a different slide that was confusing to me. And maybe it was the one before that. I don't want to belabor it, but I was.
Okay.
Other questions? I had a question because I was being distracted by the noise there in the muting. So is what you're suggesting, Richie, that is that the clothing companies, perhaps in a consortium or basically work as investors in renewable energy for their in the context of the countries, that so that they themselves, part of their responsibility is to help transform the grid. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, that is part of one of the solutions that I am suggesting. And it has been successful, as we've seen in Vietnam. They didn't have a power purchase agreement market prior to a coalition of brands advocating for this type of system in order to purchase renewable energy throughout Vietnam.
So that they themselves create that. That's a really, really radical step. I mean, that's a big step. Most of these, in response to Edie, most of these companies, you know, that's just off their radar screen completely. So to take this kind of responsibility, and I don't know, Richie, of any country that's mandating disclosure of scope 3. Most companies they don't have the data. They haven't measured it. This is a radical step to even say they should disclose. They don't know what it is. But there is a voluntary framework, a CDB reporting framework, which has scope 3 in it. So that's how it's moving along. Sorry, Richie, okay. Any other questions before we move on? I just wanted to also say that this was a kind of a new thing, and Carolyn and I were involved in, Carolyn really pushing this. We were approached by Women Forward International asking us if we wanted to partner with them, and then they found another partner to work on fashion, and so it was a whole new collaborative effort to try to make this happen. And I'm really glad that it worked out so well. Did you want to say something, Carolyn?
I had a question for Richie. I wondered if you could see a career looking at sustainability in the fashion space, or helping out Levi's or any other company.
Yeah, this has actually been really enlightening to get an in-depth look at the fashion industry and see which players are making big moves and who is doing what. So lately I've been looking at jobs in the fashion industry just because I have this knowledge now.
It's hot. It's going to be hugely exploding. So and I think the focus on energy use is spot on. It's spot on. So congratulations. I'm really glad that worked out. So thank you so much. Okay, our second presenter.
That was a really incredibly thoughtful, thorough presentation, Richie, and I'm really interested in the recommendations, and I would love to hear what Liv Simpliciano from Fashion Revolution has to say about those recommendations and how they can and are being used by Fashion Revolution and potentially other organizations.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, Richie. I guess I'd like to first kind of say that, if you don't mind me saying, that at the beginning of our time together, I think that it's fair to say that you weren't quite aware of the impact of the fashion industry on the environment and people. So it's great to see the amount of learning that you've done over the last few months of us working together. And it's really encouraging to hear that you are interested in working in the fashion industry, because it's important that we have people that have this like mindset and frame around why transparency is important to enable accountability, because that will leverage the systemic change that we so much need in the fashion industry. So yeah, it's just great to see the amount of learning and growth and understanding around these very big issues that we're facing. But in terms of the recommendations, like, of course, I very much agree with them. I like that we address things at different levels. So at Fashion Revolution, we have a 3-pillared approach to change, which cuts across, of course, what's the policy change, which you've addressed, what are the things that brands themselves can do, but I think most importantly, and what we always say is transparency is the critical first step to enable change. And by having this information that you've compiled and shared, it really gives people the tools they need, and it empowers them to ask the critical questions about how and under what conditions and what inputs are used to make our clothes. So I think the recommendations that you've shared are quite practical. And yeah, I just think it was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liv.
And do you see, Liv, in the near future, Fashion Revolution being able to choose from among these recommendations, which it sounds like many of them are kind of, you're on the same page with and maybe have been, but is there anything that this report brought specifically to the forefront that made you say, oh, well, actually, that's something we could do differently right now?
Yeah, so I guess to give a bit more of color to like the work that Richie's been doing, it was motivated in part by a grant application that we were applying for with the European Climate Foundation, which is an independent philanthropic initiative working to help tackle the climate crisis by fostering the development of a net zero emission society at the national, European, and global level. So, of course, through the Fashion Transparency Index research, we know that there's a lack of transparency around brands' disclosure on their carbon footprint. But understanding the climate crisis that we're in, we really want to develop more stringent indicators around energy and carbon emissions. So the presentation that Richie has shared and the work that he's been doing is kind of helping form the basis of that further research that we are going to be doing. But in terms of things that Richie has found, that has brought things to light, I think, the issues around the lack of transparency around where energy is coming from, particularly biomass, I think we need to be raising more awareness among civil society that it is, becoming an increasing common practice that burning wood is seen as carbon neutral when we know that that has a great environmental impact. And then secondly, the recommendations around disaggregating data on where energy is coming from. I think that's a good insight that we'd like to kind of develop more. So as I said, this research forms the basis of deeper research that we can do with climate experts in the field. So it's great to have this kind of groundwork laid for deeper research that we intend on doing.
It's great. I don't want to dominate the question time, but there are only 3 of us, so I can take that liberty. But then I do have one for Richie, but if Liv or Richie have other comments or questions, yeah.
I completely agree with everything that Liv has been saying. I think that one of the biggest, most enlightening things was seeing how there are different energy sources within the supply chain that are not being examined. And that was one of the things that, Fashion Revolution, working with Liv, I was concerned, we should really focus on getting the disclosure from brands to make sure that we understand where this energy is being sourced and what is being, are we burning wood to, create thermal energy in these facilities, or coal? Or are we sourcing this energy from the national grid, which is fossil fuel heavy anyways? So just understanding exactly where your energy is coming from is extremely important in the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that our work together is kind of highlighted is that, of course, as people, consumers, we have the option to be more mindful with the choices that we make in terms of what we buy, but more importantly, we're more than just consumers, we're also citizens, and having access to this information is really important. And then understanding that citizens do have a voice, and they have power to kind of draw attention to these issues. And you know, that like having the this information, and like that's why we need transparent disclosure from brands, because once citizens have access to that civil society, it really enables change. And I think there's a lot of confusion around the impact of the fashion industry because of the way that brands might be disclosing or not disclosing information. So we're just really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to do further research around energy and carbon emissions and develop those more stringent indicators so that we can really expose and highlight the gaps in brands reporting on these issues, because greater transparency is really needed in order to mitigate the climate crisis. We can't really meet the goals needed to keep the planet from warming without this transparency. So yeah, it's just great to have this like basis of research that we can kind of dig deeper into. And I guess, well, Richie's kind of already answered this question, but I guess what is one of the takeaways you've had kind of working with Fashion Revolution? And I guess in terms of like our vision and values, it's just great to hear like what you found working with us.
Yeah, so like I had mentioned before, and like you had said, this was kind of my first deep dive into the fashion industry and seeing what environmental and social issues are present. And working with Fashion Revolution, I've truly understood the importance of accountability and transparency. Because if you see a lot of like the reports that you get from some of these brands, I know that we had looked at a lot of different sustainability reports for the FTI, and a lot of brands, you know, say that they are reducing their emissions, but granular details are missing. Energy sources are missing. Where are they, you know, what are they doing? What milestones do they have? All of this information for many, many brands is missing. And I didn't realize that before. You know, I just kind of would take what was said for face value, but this has given me a greater insight to like look deeper and actually scrutinize some of these promises from brands.
That's great to hear. And that's like exactly what Fashion Revolution is trying to do. Like, we really just want to empower people and let them know, like, you do have a voice and you can make change by raising awareness for those around you. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that you now like have the tools and understanding of how to, you know, do the scrutiny that we're talking about. Yeah, so it's just really encouraging to hear that you feel that way.
Thank you for that question. Dr. Kent, did you have any last questions?
No, actually, I think that answers anything that I was going to ask. So this has been really wonderful and so meaningful, I'm sure, for, you know, I'm very pleased to hear it's been meaningful on both sides, the academic side and the partner organization side. And that's really what our goal is to have that be mutually beneficial so that we can, you know, again, as I mentioned, that you can see the cross section between wanting to preserve and protect our earth, the environment, and also advance women. And in doing so, it's not just women, but it's really quality of life for all humanity. And it's really important. Very pleased with what you've taken away from the project. So thank you very much. And thank you to Liv for overseeing this project with Fashion Revolution, and thank you to the faculty at Middlebury College as well.
Yeah, and if I could just close us out, or Liv, did you have something last to say?
Oh no, I was just going to say thank you, Ken, but feel free to issue any closing remarks.
Yeah, to close out, thank you so much Dr. Kent for this opportunity to look into this issue. And thank you so much, Liv and Fashion Revolution, for all of the support, for the help in researching and verifying all of these claims. It's really been an enlightening experience, and I appreciate everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. And I think that wraps up today's meeting. Any last words?
No.
All right.
There we
From my side.
are. Onward and upward.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
joining this
you.
meeting today, and have a great day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.